Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. Before we start today's case, I want to ask for your support by subscribing to the channel. Your subscription is very important to us, so please subscribe to support us, click the like button, and let's get into the case. The morning fog hugged the coastline of Monterey Bay, a gossamer veil that softened the boundary between sea and sky. Daniel Reeves stood at the edge of the beach, his paddleboard tucked under his arm, watching as the first rays of sunlight pierced through the mist. At 31, Daniel had made paddleboarding his sanctuary, a place where the stresses of his job as a software engineer dissolved into the rhythm of water and paddle. On this particular Saturday in late September, the water called to him with unusual clarity. The weather report promised calm seas and light winds, perfect conditions for exploring the kelp forests that fringed this section of California's central coast. Daniel adjusted the leash around his ankle, a safety measure he never skipped, no matter how tranquil the water appeared. 6 feet 2 inches of lean muscle, he'd spent the better part of his 20s discovering the meditative quality of standing on water, finding in it a counterbalance to the digital landscape that consumed his weekdays. "Looking good out there today," a voice called from behind him. Daniel turned to see Marco, a local fisherman who often launched his small boat from this stretch of beach. Marco was in his 60s, his face weathered by decades of sun and salt, a living nautical chart of Monterey's waters. "Morning, Marco. Any wildlife sightings lately?" Daniel asked, his eyes still on the horizon where the fog was beginning to lift. Marco secured a cooler in his aluminum skiff before answering. "Sea lions are active in the kelp beds. Saw a pod of dolphins yesterday heading north. And word is, there's been a group of orcas spotted offshore last week. They come in sometimes following the salmon or hunting seals." Daniel nodded, his interest piqued. In all his years paddling these waters, he'd seen harbor seals, sea lions, otters, and even the occasional whale spout in the distance. But never an orca. That would be something to see, he said, more to himself than to Marco. "From a distance," Marco cautioned, his tone shifting slightly. "They're smart, those killer whales. Too smart sometimes. I've seen what they can do to a seal. Not something you want a front row seat to." He paused, then added, "Just stay clear of any feeding action you might see. They get focused when they hunt." Daniel appreciated the warning, but felt the familiar surge of excitement that came with the possibility of witnessing something new on the water. "I'll keep my eyes open," he promised, sliding his board toward the gentle lap of waves against the shore. The sand was cool beneath his feet as he pushed off, the board gliding into shallow water. He knelt, paddling with practiced strokes until he cleared the small break, then smoothly transitioned to his feet. The balance came naturally now, his body adjusting to the subtle movements of the board without conscious thought. As Daniel paddled further from shore, the last traces of fog burned away, revealing the bay in its morning splendor. The water was indeed calm, a gentle swell that lifted and dropped the board in a soothing cadence. To his right, the distinctive silhouette of Monterey's coastal pines stood sentinel on the cliffs. Ahead, patches of kelp formed floating islands, their long strands reaching up from the depths like curious fingers testing the surface. Daniel set a course parallel to the shoreline, heading toward his favorite stretch of kelp forest about a mile down the coast. The rhythmic dip and pull of the paddle through water settled him into a familiar trance. His breathing synchronized with his strokes, his mind clearing of the week's accumulated digital noise. This was why he came here, to find this moving stillness. 40 minutes into his journey, Daniel paused to take a drink from the water bottle strapped to the board. The sun had fully risen now, warming his wetsuit-clad back and shoulders. He'd traveled farther than he'd initially planned, the conditions so perfect that each stroke had invited another. The shoreline had receded somewhat as his path had taken him around a small headland and into a more secluded cove. It was then that he noticed he wasn't alone. About 50 yards ahead, the water erupted in a splash as a sea lion surfaced, its sleek head glistening in the sunlight. Daniel smiled, always appreciative of these encounters. The sea lion regarded him briefly with large, expressive eyes before disappearing beneath the surface again. Daniel remained still, hoping for another glimpse. Moments passed, and there was another splash, this time closer to a dense patch of Kelp. The sea lion reappeared, and Daniel could now see it was carrying something in its mouth. A fish, he guessed, its silver scales catching the light as the sea lion tossed it into the air before catching it again. Fascinated by the display, Daniel slowly paddled closer, careful not to disturb the animal's meal. The sea lion seemed unconcerned by his presence, continuing its methodical dismantling of the fish. As Daniel watched, he became aware of something different about the water around him, a subtle shift in pressure, a change in the way sound carried across the surface. Without warning, the sea lion's behavior changed dramatically. It abandoned its meal and dove, resurfacing seconds later with frantic energy, barking loudly before disappearing beneath the surface again. The sudden transformation from leisurely dining to panic was stark, and Daniel felt a corresponding surge of adrenaline. His eyes scanned the water, trying to identify what had spooked the sea lion. The surface returned to its deceptive calm, giving no hint of the drama unfolding beneath. Daniel had read enough about marine life to know that predator-prey interactions happened constantly in these waters, usually invisible to human eyes. He was about to resume paddling when he saw a disturbance in the water about 30 yards away, moving with purpose. At first he thought it might be the sea lion again, but this was different, larger, more directed, a dark shape cutting through the water with unmistakable intent. Daniel's heart rate accelerated as recognition dawned. The distinctive black, dorsal fin sliced through the surface, tall and straight, unmistakable in its silhouette. An orca. The realization sent a conflicting rush of excitement and apprehension through him. Marco's warning echoed in his mind. They get focused when they hunt. Instinct told Daniel to maintain distance, to observe without interfering. He remained still on his board, paddle resting across his thighs, watching as the dorsal fin disappeared beneath the surface. The bay returned to its morning serenity, as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. But Daniel knew better. Somewhere beneath him, a hunt was in progress. He considered turning back, giving the marine predator wide berth. Yet curiosity held him. In place, the chance to witness something few paddleboarders ever saw up close. Minutes passed. Daniel began to wonder if the orca had moved on, following the sea lion to deeper waters. He took up his paddle again, intending to head back toward shore, when the water to his right exploded in a violent surge. The sea lion burst from the surface, its body fully airborne in a desperate leap that carried it within 15 feet of Daniel's board. Time seemed to slow as Daniel registered the animal's terror, its eyes wide, its powerful body contorted in flight. Then, in a heart-stopping moment, something massive rose from the water directly behind it. The orca breached in pursuit, its black and white form glistening with terrible beauty. Over 20 feet of apex predator cleared the surface, jaws open, revealing rows of conical teeth designed for grasping prey. Daniel froze, transfixed by the primal display of predatory power. In that suspended moment, several things happened at once. The sea lion, in its panic, changed direction mid-air, angling toward Daniel's board as if seeking refuge on any available surface. The orca, fully committed to its chase, could not alter its trajectory, and Daniel, finally breaking free from his stunned immobility, tried to backpedal his board away from the collision course. His reaction came too late. The sea lion crashed into the water mere feet from his board, sending a spray of salt water into Daniel's face. He blinked against the sting, momentarily blinded. When his vision cleared, he had just enough time to register the massive form of Orca. The orca, redirecting its bulk with surprising agility, coming straight toward him. The impact, when it came, was not what Daniel expected. Rather than a direct hit, the orca clipped the tail end of his paddleboard, possibly attempting to avoid the human obstacle in its path. But the glancing blow was more than enough. The board lurched violently, catapulting Daniel into the air. His paddle flew from his grasp as he tumbled, disoriented, into the cold embrace of Monterey Bay. The shock of immersion drove the air from his lungs. Daniel thrashed to the surface, gasping, his mind struggling to process what had happened. His board, still attached to his ankle by the leash, bobbed nearby, flipped upside down by the collision. Of the sea lion there was no sign. The orca had disappeared beneath the surface as well. Daniel lunged for his board, his training taking over despite the panic flooding his system. "Get out of the water," a voice screamed in his head, a primal recognition of his sudden vulnerability. No longer an observer safely separated from the marine drama, he was now an unintended participant, adrift in a hunting ground. His fingers closed on the edge of the board, and he pulled it toward him, intending to flip it right side up and clamber back to safety. That was when he felt it, a solid mass brushing against his legs beneath the surface. Something large was moving beneath him, circling. Panic threatened to overwhelm him. Daniel fought it back, knowing that clear thinking was his only ally now. He pulled harder on the board, managing to turn it over, revealing a visible dent where the orca had struck it. He was reaching to pull himself up when the water around him seemed to shift, a pressure change that raised the hairs on the back of his neck. The orca surfaced 10 feet away, its dorsal fin cutting the water like a knife, its black eye regarding him with an intelligence that was unmistakable. Daniel froze, half in and half out of the water, knowing that any sudden movement might trigger a predatory response. The orca circled slowly, deliberate in its assessment. Daniel had read enough about orcas to know they were highly intelligent, capable of distinguishing between different types of prey. They rarely attacked humans in the wild. There were almost no recorded fatalities from wild orca encounters, but these facts provided little comfort as he watched the massive predator circle, its intentions unreadable. "Just checking me out," Daniel whispered to himself, trying to control his breathing. "Just curious." But even as he sought to reassure himself, another part of his brain was calculating his distance from shore, the likelihood of reaching it before the orca could intercept him if it chose to. The odds didn't seem favorable. He was at least half a mile out, and orcas could swim at speeds approaching 30 miles per hour when motivated. The standoff continued for what felt like an eternity, but was likely less than a minute. The orca made another pass, closer this time, its massive body rolling slightly to keep one eye fixed on the strange creature at the surface. Daniel remained as still as possible, only his eyes moving to track the predator's path. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the orca dove, its flukes lifting clear of the water before slipping beneath the surface. Daniel didn't wait to see if it would return. With desperate energy, he hauled himself onto the board, his movements clumsy with adrenaline and fear. Once aboard, he lay flat on his stomach, making himself as stable as possible without his paddle, which was now floating about 20 yards away. Using his hands as makeshift paddles, Daniel began pushing toward shore, keeping his body low to maintain stability. Every few seconds he glanced over his shoulder, expecting to see the orca's fin cutting through the water in pursuit, but the surface remained undisturbed. He had covered perhaps 50 yards when the sea erupted again, this time off to his left. The sea lion resurfaced, still very much alive, its desperate barking carrying across the water. It was swimming hard, angling toward the kelp beds where it might find refuge in the tangle of underwater forest. Daniel ceased his paddling, watching with horrified fascination. The sea lion was injured, trailing a slick of red in its wake. It had escaped the initial attack, but was clearly compromised. As if on cue, the water behind it swelled, and the orca reappeared, its pursuit relentless. The chase was heading away from Daniel, back toward the denser patch of kelp. Relief flooded through him. The orca's attention was fully fixed on its original prey. He resumed his awkward paddling, maintaining his course toward shore, trying to make as little disturbance as possible. His progress was agonizingly slow, without a proper paddle. Each handstroke moved him only a small distance, and the current was gradually pushing him parallel to the shore rather than directly toward it. Daniel knew he needed to angle his approach to compensate, but doing so efficiently without a paddle was challenging. 5 minutes into his retreat, Daniel paused to rest his burning shoulder muscles and check his position. He'd made some progress toward shore, but not as much as he'd hoped. The kelp bed where the sea lion had sought refuge was now about 100 yards to his right. Of the orca, there was no immediate sign. Daniel was about to resume paddling when a sound reached him across the water, a series of high-pitched whistles and clicks, followed by what could only be described as a thunderous underwater exhalation. The vocalizations sent a chill through him. They sounded nothing like the sea lions barking. This was something else entirely. His eyes scanned the kelp bed, trying to locate the source. Movement caught his attention, not the clean slice of a dorsal fin, but a chaotic thrashing among the floating strands of kelp. The sea lion was fighting for its life, its struggles growing weaker as Daniel watched. Then, shockingly, the water beyond the kelp erupted as a second orca breached, its massive body clearing the surface completely before crashing back in a shower of spray. Daniel's breath caught in his throat, not one orca but two, possibly more beneath the surface. Marco's words came back to him with chilling clarity. They're smart, those killer whales. Orcas were known to hunt in coordinated packs, using sophisticated strategies to corral and capture prey. The animals Daniel was witnessing weren't acting on blind instinct, but executing a planned ambush, one orca driving the sea lion into the kelp where another waited. The realization that he had inadvertently placed himself in the middle of a coordinated hunt by multiple apex predators sent a fresh surge of adrenaline through Daniel's system. He redoubled his efforts, paddling frantically now, abandoning any pretense of moving quietly. His progress was still frustratingly slow. The shore seemed to retreat with each stroke rather than draw closer. Daniel's arms burned with exertion, unused to this awkward method of propulsion. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool morning air, and his breathing came in ragged gasps. He had covered perhaps another 100 yards when the water ahead of him suddenly darkened. Daniel froze, his hands suspended above the water mid-stroke. Something was approaching from directly in front of him, something large enough to displace a visible volume of water. For a wild moment, Daniel considered detaching the leash from his ankle and abandoning the board entirely, reasoning that he might be less conspicuous as a swimmer. But reason prevailed. Without the board, he'd have no hope of reaching shore before exhaustion claimed him. The darkness beneath the surface resolved into a sleek form, black and white, moving with the fluid grace unique to these ocean predators. One of the orcas was investigating him again, perhaps drawn by his increased movement. It circled once, twice, keeping a distance of about 20 feet, its dorsal fin occasionally breaking the surface. Daniel held perfectly still, his heart hammering against his ribs. The orca completed a third circuit, then angled away, diving deeper. Daniel waited, counting to 30 in his head before resuming his paddling, his movements more measured now despite his growing desperation. Time stretched and compressed in strange ways as he continued his journey toward shore. The sun climbed higher, burning away the last wisps of morning fog, revealing the full expanse of the bay around him. Daniel periodically checked for signs of the orcas, but they seemed to have moved on, perhaps following the currents carrying traces of the sea lion's blood. After what felt like hours but was likely closer to 20 minutes, Daniel had closed almost half the distance to shore. His makeshift paddling technique had improved somewhat with necessity, and the current had shifted slightly in his favor. For the first time since the initial collision, he allowed himself to believe he might make it back safely. That was when his board suddenly lurched beneath him, nearly throwing him off again. There was no visible cause, no wave, no surface disturbance. Just a violent movement, as if something had bumped the board from below. Daniel clutched the edges, stabilizing himself, cold dread washing over him. Before he could react further, the board lurched again, more forcefully this time. Daniel felt it lift slightly on one side, as if being pushed from below. His mind raced through possibilities. Perhaps he had drifted over a submerged rock, or a strong current was creating turbulence beneath him. The third impact removed all doubt. Something solid struck the underside of the board with enough force to crack the fiberglass. The sound of splintering material was unmistakable. Water began seeping through the damaged section, and the board's buoyancy noticeably decreased. Daniel knew with terrible certainty what was happening. The orca, or one of them, had returned and was investigating his board with increasing aggression. Whether it was confusing the board with prey or simply curious about this unusual object in its territory, the result was the same. His flotation was compromised, and he was still too far from shore to swim. Desperation drove Daniel to a new strategy. He began shouting, slapping the surface of the water with his open palm, making as much noise and disturbance as possible. He had read somewhere that orcas, despite their fearsome reputation, were cautious around unfamiliar stimuli. Perhaps he could startle it away. "Hey, hey!" he yelled, his voice carrying oddly over the water. The slapping created concentric rings that spread across the surface, distorting the morning light. For a few moments, it seemed to work. The impact ceased, and the water around him grew still once more. Daniel seized the opportunity, paddling furiously, ignoring the water now pooling on his board from the breach in its integrity. He needed to cover ground quickly before the board became too waterlogged to support him. Each stroke was a prayer, a plea for distance, for safety. He had managed another 50 yards when the water ahead of him parted, and an orca rose vertically, its head emerging like a submarine. Surfacing. This wasn't a predatory breach but a spy hop, a behavior orcas use to get a better look at things above the water. The animal held position, its massive head and upper torso exposed, black eyes regarding Daniel with unnerving intelligence. Daniel froze, his hands gripping the edges of his damaged board. The orca was close enough that he could see the texture of its skin, the precise delineation between black and white coloration. For a suspended moment, predator and human assessed each other, representatives of two highly intelligent species encountering one another in circumstances neither fully comprehended. Then, with a deliberate motion, the orca sank back beneath the surface. Daniel remained frozen, unsure what to make of this latest development. Was the animal losing interest, or was this part of some more complex assessment? He didn't have long to wonder. The water 30 feet to his right suddenly erupted as one of the orcas, he couldn't be sure if it was the same one, launched into a full breach, its entire body clearing the water before crashing back with a thunderous impact. The display sent a sheet of spray over Daniel and created a wave that rocked his damaged board dangerously. As the water settled, Daniel noticed something that turned his blood to ice. His paddle, which had been floating some distance away, was gone. In its place were fragments of fiberglass and foam, the unmistakable remains of a paddle that had been crushed by tremendous force. The message couldn't have been clearer. The orcas were capable of destroying his equipment with ease. His board, already damaged, would offer little protection if they turned their attention to it with similar intent. Daniel abandoned any remaining hope of reaching shore on the board. It was taking on water too quickly now, and the orca's behavior was growing more unpredictable. His only chance was to make it to the kelp forest about 75 yards to his right. Kelp beds created natural barriers that might offer some protection, or at least make it more difficult for large predators to maneuver. He changed course, angling toward the floating mass of vegetation. The board responded sluggishly, its waterlogged state making it increasingly difficult to control. Daniel compensated by shifting his weight, using his body to steer as much as his hands. The distance to the kelp bed seemed to expand with each stroke. Daniel's arms burned, his shoulders screaming in protest. The wetsuit that had earlier protected him from the morning chill now felt constricting, limiting his range of motion as he fought to propel the failing board forward. He was perhaps 30 yards from the edge of the kelp when the board gave a final sickening lurch. The crack that had been slowly widening suddenly split completely, the board folding in on itself like a closing book. Daniel tumbled forward into the water, the sudden immersion shocking his system anew. He surfaced, gasping, to find himself floating amid the two halves of his ruined board, still attached to his ankle by the leash. The pieces retained some buoyancy, but not enough to support his weight. Daniel grabbed one half, using it as a makeshift flotation device while he considered his rapidly diminishing options. Swimming to shore from this position was technically possible, but dangerously exhausting. The kelp bed remained his best option for immediate safety. Daniel oriented himself toward it and began swimming with powerful strokes, towing the remnants of his board behind him. His progress was steady, but painfully slow. Each stroke required fighting against the drag of the broken board. Daniel considered detaching it entirely, but hesitated to abandon his only remaining equipment. The fiberglass pieces might serve as shields if the worst happened, something to put between himself and investigating teeth. He had covered about half the distance to the kelp when he felt it, a presence in the water beneath him, moving with purpose. Daniel kicked harder, driving himself forward with renewed desperation. The edge of the kelp bed was tantalizingly close now, its floating fronds promising at least the illusion of shelter. 20 feet from safety, the water around Daniel surged. Something massive rose from below, not striking him directly but creating a pressure wave that sent him tumbling through the water. When he righted himself, spitting out salt water, he saw one of the orcas surface nearby, its dorsal fin cutting the water as it circled back toward him. Daniel abandoned the broken board, finally detaching the leash from his ankle. Unencumbered, he swam with everything he had, his focus narrowed to the kelp bed ahead and nothing else. His fingers reached out, grasping for the slippery strands, finding purchase. He pulled himself into the floating forest, tangling his body among the thick stems. The kelp was dense here, creating a natural barrier that extended from the surface down to the seafloor some 30 feet below. Daniel wrapped the vegetation around his arms, anchoring himself in place, trying to control his ragged breathing. Through gaps in the kelp, he could see open water. One orca continued to circle, its fin visible as it patrolled the perimeter of the kelp bed. Of the second orca, there was no sign, though Daniel knew it could be anywhere, perhaps directly beneath him in the shadowy forest of kelp. Minutes passed in this tenuous standoff. Daniel's position was far from ideal. The kelp offered some protection, but he couldn't remain here indefinitely. His body was already beginning to feel the effects of cold water immersion despite his wetsuit. His muscles trembled with exertion and the first hints of hypothermia. The circling orca occasionally approached the edge of the kelp, its massive body sliding past the outer fronds like a shadow. Each pass brought it slightly closer, testing the boundaries of this obstacle to its curiosity. Daniel watched with growing apprehension, aware that the animal was methodically exploring the kelp's perimeter, perhaps seeking a path through. From somewhere deeper in the kelp forest came a sound that momentarily distracted Daniel from his vigil, a faint barking that could only belong to a sea lion. Incredibly, it seemed the orca's original prey had also sought refuge in this floating sanctuary and was still alive. The shared predicament created an odd sense of kinship. Both were prey now, both seeking protection in the same green fortress. But while the sea lion was in its natural environment, capable of navigating the kelp with practiced ease, Daniel was an interloper, awkwardly clinging to unfamiliar terrain. The barking grew louder, then changed in pitch, a warning call. Daniel turned in time to see the water churn as something large moved through the kelp about 20 feet away. The vegetation parted as an orca pushed through, its black and white form visible in flashes between the green strands. Cold realization washed over Daniel. The kelp wasn't an impenetrable barrier to these predators. They could navigate it when motivated, using their intelligence and agility to find paths through the tangled growth. The sea lion's warning had revealed this truth too late. Daniel released his hold on the kelp, pushing deeper into the forest, seeking denser growth that might slow the orca's approach. His movements were hampered by the very vegetation he sought. For protection, the long strands wrapping around his legs and arms as he fought his way through. Behind him, the disturbance in the kelp grew more violent. The sea lion's barking reached a frantic pitch, then cut off abruptly. Daniel didn't need to see what had happened to understand. The orca had found its prey. A primal part of him hoped that the sea lion would satisfy the predator's hunger, that they would leave after securing their original target. But another part knew better. Orcas were known to play with prey, to continue hunting even when not hungry, motivated by curiosity and intelligence as much as by hunger. Daniel pushed on, each movement a battle against exhaustion and the clutching kelp. He was operating on instinct now, driven by the need to put distance between himself and the feeding predators. His sense of direction was compromised by the closed environment of the kelp forest, but he believed he was moving roughly parallel to the shoreline. following the contour of the kelp bed. Time lost meaning as he struggled through the green maze. The sun's position told him that at least an hour had passed since the initial collision. His arms and legs moved mechanically now, responding to commands from a brain growing increasingly fogged by cold and exertion. Eventually, the density of the kelp began to thin. Daniel paused, treading water in a small clearing, trying to orient himself. Through a gap, he caught a glimpse of open water, and beyond it, blessedly, the shore. He had traveled along the kelp bed and emerged at its northern end, closer to land than when he'd entered. There was no sign of the orcas from his position. The water around the kelp bed appeared calm, undisturbed. Daniel allowed himself a moment of hope. Perhaps they had moved on after catching the sea lion, their curiosity about the strange human intruder forgotten. The shore looked to be about a quarter-mile away, a challenging swim under normal circumstances, potentially impossible in his current exhausted state. But there was no alternative. Daniel took several deep breaths, preparing himself for the final push to safety. As he was about to leave the shelter of the kelp, a flicker of movement in the water beyond made him hesitate. At first, he thought it might be his imagination, a trick of light on water. Then he saw it clearly, a dorsal fin cutting the surface in a path that would intercept his route to shore. The orca was patrolling the open, water between the kelp bed and the beach, moving back and forth in a deliberate pattern. Whether it was waiting specifically for Daniel or simply continuing its exploration of the area, the effect was the same. The path to safety was blocked. Despair threatened to overwhelm him. Daniel's body was reaching its limits. His muscles ached with fatigue and the cold had penetrated deep despite his wetsuit. He could feel his thoughts becoming sluggish, his decision-making impaired by the early stages of hypothermia. As if sensing his predicament, the circling orca changed its pattern, swimming directly toward the gap in the kelp where Daniel floated. It approached slowly, almost cautiously, its dorsal fin slicing the surface like a shark's, but much larger, more pronounced. Daniel retreated back into the denser kelp, his heart pounding against his ribs. The orca paused at the edge of the vegetation, its massive head partially visible beneath the surface. For a moment, predator and prey regarded each other across the boundary of kelp. Then, with deliberate motion, the orca began pushing into the kelp, its powerful body parting the strands as it advanced. Daniel turned and fled deeper into the forest, no longer concerned with direction, focused only on immediate escape. Kelp grew thicker again, slowing his progress but also, he hoped, impeding the much larger orca. His flight took him to a section of kelp he hadn't traversed before, where the strands seemed anchored to something solid rather than floating freely. Daniel's feet brushed against rock, a submerged formation that the kelp had colonized. He pulled himself toward it, finding a small ledge that allowed him to stand chest-deep in water, partially concealed by the surrounding vegetation. This unexpected sanctuary provided momentary relief for his exhausted limbs. Daniel clung to the rock, his breathing gradually slowing as he assessed his situation. The rock formation appeared to be part of a larger underwater structure, possibly an extension of a nearby point that jutted into the bay. From his perch, Daniel could see slivers of the world beyond the kelp. The shoreline remained tantalizingly visible, but unreachable. The sun had climbed higher, approaching midday, its warmth unable to penetrate the chill that had settled into his core. Movement in the kelp pulled his attention back to immediate dangers. The orca was still searching, its passage marked by the swaying of kelp fronds about 30 feet away. It was moving more slowly now, navigating with care through the denser sections. Daniel pressed himself against the rock, trying to minimize his profile. The kelp provided some visual cover, but he knew orcas relied on echolocation as well as sight. Whether this sensory capability could distinguish a human from the surrounding environment at close range was a question Daniel had never considered before, and now desperately needed answered. The disturbance in the kelp grew closer. Daniel could see flashes of black and white through the green curtain, glimpses of the orca's massive body as it methodically quartered the area. It wasn't moving like a predator in hunting mode, but like a curious investigator, its progress deliberate and thorough. Daniel remained motionless, scarcely breathing as the orca approached his hiding place. It paused about 15 feet away, its outline visible through the swaying kelp. For a moment, he thought it might turn away, having lost interest or sensed some more compelling attraction elsewhere. Then the kelp directly in front of Daniel parted, and he found himself face to face with the ocean's apex predator. The orca's head was massive, its black skin glistening in the filtered sunlight. One eye, dark, intelligent, alien, regarded Daniel with unmistakable focus. The animal held perfectly still, suspended in the water as if defying gravity, its presence dominating Daniel's entire field of vision. Time stretched into an eternal moment as human and predator assessed each other. Daniel could see his own reflection in the orca's eye, a distorted image of terror frozen in a glossy black orb. His mind registered absurd details, the fine texture of the orca's skin, the precise pattern of its markings, the subtle movement of water around its massive form. Then, with a deliberate motion that could only be described as casual, the orca turned and moved away, its tail flukes propelling it through the kelp with surprising delicacy given its size. Daniel remained frozen, unable to comprehend what had just happened. The predator had seen him, had been close enough to strike, yet had chosen to withdraw. He waited, counting his heartbeats, expecting the orca to return with more aggressive intent. But the minutes stretched on, and the kelp around him remained undisturbed. Gradually, Daniel allowed himself to believe that the encounter might be over, that the orca's curiosity had been satisfied. With extreme caution, he shifted position on the rock, trying to regain some circulation in his numbed limbs. The movement sent a cascade of small bubbles rising through the kelp, a minor disturbance, but enough to remind him of his vulnerability. As a feeling returned to his extremities, Daniel became aware of a new sensation, a vibration in the water, rhythmic and mechanical rather than organic. It took his cold-fogged brain several moments to identify the sound, a boat engine, approaching from the direction of the shore. Hope surged through him. Someone had spotted the broken paddleboard, perhaps, or noticed his prolonged absence. Whatever, the reason the sound represented his first real chance of rescue since the nightmare began. Daniel pushed away from the rock, fighting through the kelp toward the sound. His progress was painfully slow, each movement requiring conscious effort, from muscles pushed beyond their limits. But the engine sound grew louder, more distinct, driving him forward. He broke through the outer edge of the kelp bed to see a small fishing boat about 100 yards away, moving parallel to the shoreline. Daniel recognized the aluminum hull, Marco's boat. The old fisherman was scanning the water, his posture alert, searching. Daniel raised his arms above his head, waving frantically, trying to make himself visible to the searcher. "Here," he shouted, his voice cracking from thirst and exhaustion. "Marco, over here!" For a heart-stopping moment, he thought the boat would continue past without seeing him. Then it changed course, the engine note dropping as Marco throttled back and turned toward the kelp bed. Daniel continued waving, spending the last of his energy to ensure he remained visible. The boat approached cautiously, Marco standing at the helm, one hand shading his eyes as he peered toward the kelp bed. When he spotted Daniel, his weathered face registered first surprise, then relief. He maneuvered the small craft closer, cutting the engine to an idle as he came alongside. "Jesus, Daniel," Marco called, already reaching for a boat hook. "What the hell happened to you? Your board washed up in pieces an hour ago. The Coast Guard's been notified, but I figured I'd start looking." Daniel grasped the extended hook, allowing Marco to pull him toward the boat. "Orcas," he managed, the word encompassing the entire terrifying experience. "They were hunting. Hit my board." Marco's expression darkened as he helped Daniel over the gunwale. "Killers out there, huh? Been reports of a pod working the bay this past week. Didn't think they'd come this close to shore." He wrapped a blanket around Daniel's shoulders, noting the violent trembling that had overtaken his body. "You're hypothermic. Sit down before you fall down." Daniel collapsed onto the bench seat, his legs refusing to support him any longer. The relief of rescue, combined with the cumulative effects of cold and exhaustion, left him lightheaded and disconnected from his surroundings. He was vaguely aware of Marco radioing the Coast Guard, reporting that he had found the missing paddleboarder alive. As Marco turned the boat toward shore, Daniel found himself scanning the water behind them, half expecting to see a dorsal fin in pursuit. But the surface remained undisturbed, giving no hint of the predators that patrolled beneath. "Did you actually see them?" Marco asked, dividing his attention between Daniel and his navigation. "The orcas?" Daniel nodded, the memory vivid despite his fatigue. "Two, maybe more. They were hunting a sea lion. I got in the way." The simple explanation felt wholly inadequate to describe what he had experienced, but it was all he could manage. Marco shook his head, his expression grim. "You're lucky to be alive. Those animals don't usually bother with humans, but when they're in hunting mode." He left the sentence unfinished, the implication clear. The journey back to shore passed in a blur for Daniel. The Coast Guard had dispatched a response boat which intercepted them halfway. Daniel was transferred to the larger vessel, where emergency medical technicians immediately began treatment for hypothermia and exhaustion. By the time they reached the harbor, Daniel had been wrapped in thermal blankets, given warm fluids, and assessed for other injuries. Besides muscle fatigue and mild hypothermia, he had escaped the encounter relatively unscathed physically. The EMTs recommended a hospital evaluation, which Daniel didn't resist. As they loaded him into the waiting ambulance, Daniel caught a final glimpse of the bay stretching out behind him. Somewhere in those waters, the orcas continued their ancient patterns, hunting, feeding, living according to instincts honed over millions of years of evolution. For a brief, terrifying interval, his life had intersected with theirs, and against all odds he had survived to tell the tale. The ambulance doors closed, sealing him away from the ocean and the predators that called it home. As the vehicle pulled away, carrying him toward human habitation and medical care, Daniel closed his eyes, the rhythmic sway of transportation so different from the motion of waves, yet somehow reminiscent of the board that had carried him into danger. In the darkness behind his eyelids, he saw again the orca's eye regarding him through the kelp, intelligent and alien, neither malevolent nor benign, simply other. The image would stay with him long after the physical effects of the encounter had faded. The emergency room at Monterey Peninsula Hospital buzzed with quiet efficiency as Daniel was admitted for observation. The attending physician, Dr. Melissa Chen, reviewed the EMT's report with professional interest, her questions precise and focused. "You're one of the lucky ones," she commented as she checked his core temperature, which had risen to near normal with treatment. "Orca encounters that close rarely end this well." Daniel managed a weak smile, still wrapped in thermal blankets on the examination table. Didn't feel lucky at the time. Dr. Chen made a note in his chart. "I'd like to keep you overnight for observation. Hypothermia can have delayed effects, and you've been through significant trauma, both physical and psychological." Daniel didn't argue. The thought of returning to his empty apartment held little appeal, and his body was making its exhaustion known in increasingly insistent ways. Every muscle ached, including some he hadn't been aware of possessing. His hands were raw from clutching kelp, and salt had chafed his skin wherever his wetsuit had allowed water to enter. As he was being settled into a hospital room, his phone, miraculously still functional in its waterproof case, began ringing. The caller ID showed his sister's name, Catherine. News traveled fast in a small community like Monterey. "Danny? Oh my God, are you okay?" Catherine's voice carried the sharp edge of panic barely contained. "I just heard from Marco's daughter that you were attacked by killer whales." "I'm fine, Kat," Daniel assured her, wincing at the exaggeration that had already attached itself to his experience. "Not attacked exactly, more like an accidental collision. I'm at the hospital, but just for observation." "I'm on my way," she said, the background noise suggesting she was already in motion. "I'll be there in 40 minutes. Before Daniel could protest that it wasn't necessary, she had ended the call. He set the phone on the bedside table, not surprised by her reaction. Catherine had appointed herself his protector after their parents' death 5 years earlier, despite being the younger sibling. Her immediate response to any crisis was to establish physical proximity, as if her presence alone could ward off further harm. By the time Catherine arrived, Daniel had been settled into a room, his vital signs monitored by quietly beeping machines. She burst through the door with characteristic energy, her red hair escaping from a hasty ponytail, her face tight with worry. "You look terrible," she announced, dropping her purse and jacket on a chair before approaching the bed. Her critical assessment took in his pallor, the dark circles under his eyes, the hospital gown that emphasized his suddenly fragile appearance. "Thanks," Daniel replied dryly. "You should see the other guy." The joke fell flat. Catherine's expression didn't soften as she took his hand, her fingers cool against his still chilled skin. "What happened?" "Marco's daughter said your paddleboard was smashed to pieces." Daniel recounted the experience as clinically as possible, trying to minimize the danger to spare her additional worry. But Catherine knew him too well, reading between the careful lines of his narrative to the terror that lay beneath. "You could have died out there," she said when he finished, her voice small, vulnerable, in a way she rarely allowed herself to. "Perhaps all alone in the water with those predators hunting you." "But I didn't," Daniel reminded her gently. "I'm here, a little beat up, very tired, but basically okay." Catherine nodded, visibly gathering herself. "Right, you're okay, that's what matters." She squeezed his hand once more before releasing it, her practical nature reasserting itself. "Do they want you to stay overnight? Because I can bring you some real clothes and your toothbrush." The conversation shifted to logistics, a safer territory than the emotional undercurrents that threatened to pull them both under. Catherine made a list of items to retrieve from his apartment, then left to collect them, promising to return before visiting hours ended. In the quiet after her departure, exhaustion finally claimed Daniel. He drifted into sleep, his dreams immediately filled with dark water and massive shapes moving just beyond the edge of vision. He woke with a start, disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings, until the steady beep of monitors reminded him where he was. A nurse checked on him shortly after, administering pain medication for his aching muscles and noting his improved color. "You're bouncing." "Back quickly," she observed. "Dr. Chen will be by in the morning to assess whether you can be discharged." Catherine returned as promised, bringing not only the requested items, but also his favorite takeout from a Thai restaurant near his apartment. The familiar food was a comfort, grounding him in normalcy after a day that had been anything but normal. As they ate, Catherine filled the conversational space with updates about her work at the Monterey Bay Aquarium, where she served as a marine mammal specialist. The irony of her profession in light of the day's events wasn't lost on either of them, but they tacitly avoided addressing it directly. It wasn't until she was preparing to leave that Catherine finally broached the subject again. "You know," she said, carefully casual, "we have a marine trauma psychologist on staff at the aquarium. She works with people who've had difficult encounters with ocean wildlife. I could give her a call if you want." Daniel's first instinct was to decline, to insist he was fine. But the memory of the orca's eye regarding him through the kelp stopped the automatic response. "Maybe," he conceded. "Let's see how I feel in a few days." Catherine nodded, visibly relieved that he hadn't immediately rejected the suggestion. "Just think about it. No pressure." She gathered her things, then paused at the door. "Call me if you need anything during the night, okay? Anything at all." After she left, Daniel found himself alone with thoughts he'd been holding at bay. The hospital room felt suddenly too small, too sterile, too removed from the vastness of the ocean where he'd nearly lost his life. The contrast was disorienting. Here, surrounded by technology and human care, the morning's events seemed almost dreamlike in their improbability. Yet the ache in his muscles was real enough, as was the residual chill that persisted despite the warm hospital room. More than the physical discomfort, though, was the sense that something fundamental had shifted in his perception of the world and his place in it. For years, Daniel had found peace on the water, a sanctuary from the demands of his tech-focused career. The paddleboard had been his meditation mat, the rhythmic stroke of the paddle through water his mantra. That relationship with the ocean had been altered irrevocably. No longer a benevolent host, it had revealed its other face. The wilderness beneath the surface, operating according to ancient rules of predator and prey. Sleep came fitfully that night, interrupted by dreams of dark water and circling shadows. Each time he woke, the hospital room reasserted its reality, the beeping monitors a technological tether to the human world. Each time he drifted back to sleep, the dreams returned, variations on a theme of pursuit and exposure. Morning arrived with a shaft of sunlight through the window blinds and the clatter of breakfast trays being delivered. Daniel sat up carefully, cataloguing the complaints of various muscle groups. The pain was present but manageable, his body already beginning the process of recovery. Dr. Chen arrived shortly after breakfast, reviewing his chart with brisk efficiency. "Your vitals are stable and your core temperature has normalized," she reported. "How are you feeling?" "Sore," Daniel admitted, "but better than yesterday." The doctor nodded, making a note. "That's to be expected. You pushed your body to its limits and beyond. The muscle soreness may actually increase over the next day or two before it starts to improve." She looked up from the chart, her expression more personal. "Any nightmares, flashbacks, anxiety?" Daniel hesitated, unwilling to admit to the dreams that had plagued his sleep. "Nothing serious," he said finally. Dr. Chen regarded him skeptically, but didn't press the issue. "I'm going to discharge you, but with some conditions. Complete rest for the next 48 hours. No work, no strenuous activity. Follow up with your primary care physician next week." She paused, then added, "And I'd recommend speaking with someone about the psychological aspects of what you experienced. Trauma can manifest in unexpected ways, sometimes delayed." It was the second time in 12 hours that therapy had been suggested. Daniel nodded non-committally, accepting the discharge paperwork and prescriptions for muscle relaxants and mild pain relievers. Catherine arrived to drive him home, her car loaded with additional supplies she deemed necessary for his recovery: sports drinks to replace electrolytes, easy-to-prepare meals, a heating pad for sore muscles. Her apartment was closer to the hospital than his, and she had already decided he would stay with her for at least the first night home. "I'm not an invalid, Cat," Daniel protested weakly as she ushered him into her guest room. "I can take care of myself." "Of course you can," she agreed, setting down his overnight bag. "But you don't have to. That's what family is for." The simple statement affected Daniel more deeply than he expected. After years of self-reliance, of building a life structured around his independence, the vulnerability of accepting help felt both foreign and necessary. Catherine's apartment overlooked a small park, the ocean just visible as a strip of blue on the horizon. Daniel stood at the window, watching the distant water glitter in the midday sun. From this distance, it appeared benign, its dangers concealed beneath a serene surface. "Do you want to talk about it?" Catherine asked quietly, joining him at the window. "Really talk about it, I mean. Not the sanitized version you gave me yesterday." Daniel continued to stare at the distant horizon. "I don't know if I have the words yet," he admitted finally. "It was—" He trailed off, searching for an adequate description and finding none. Catherine nodded, understanding without explanation. Her work with marine mammals gave her a perspective few others would have. "When you're ready, then." The day passed quietly. Daniel alternated between sleeping and watching mindless television, his body demanding rest while his mind sought distraction. Catherine kept her distance, intuitively recognizing his need for space while remaining within call if needed. It wasn't until evening, as they sat on her balcony watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, that Daniel finally found words for the experience. "I always thought of myself as a visitor in their world," he said, his gaze on the darkening horizon. "Respectful, aware, but fundamentally separate. Yesterday showed me how artificial that boundary is." He paused, organizing thoughts that had been swirling beneath the surface all day. "When that orca looked at me through the kelp, there was recognition. Not of me specifically, but of me as something alive, something to be assessed, prey or not prey, threat or not threat." Catherine remained silent, allowing him the space to articulate feelings still in formation. "We build these narratives about our relationship with nature," Daniel continued. "Stewardship or harmony or whatever term makes us comfortable. But underneath all that is something more primal. Yesterday I was just another animal in the water, subject to the same rules as everything else out there. Does that frighten you? Catherine asked gently. Daniel considered the question carefully. Yes, he acknowledged finally. But not in the way you might think. Not fear of the orcas themselves or even of being in the water again. It's more a recognition of how thin the veneer of control really is, how quickly all our human constructs can become irrelevant. The conversation lapsed into silence as darkness claimed the last light from the sky. Stars emerged overhead, another wilderness beyond human reach, despite centuries of scientific understanding. The parallels weren't lost on Daniel. Ocean depths and star-filled space, both fundamentally alien to human experience, yet objects of endless fascination. That night, the dreams returned with greater intensity. Daniel found himself once again in the kelp forest, but this time without even the broken remnants of his board for protection. The water around him was alive with movement, shadows passing just beyond the range of clear vision. He tried to climb, higher in the kelp, seeking the surface, but each strand dissolved at his touch, leaving him sinking deeper into darkening water. He woke, gasping, sheets tangled around his legs like clinging kelp. The digital clock on the nightstand showed 3:17 a.m., its red numerals the only light in the unfamiliar room. Daniel sat up, disentangling himself from the bedding, his heart racing with residual fear. Sleep seemed unlikely to return, so he made his way quietly to the kitchen, careful not to wake Catherine. A glass of water helped ground him in the present moment, the simple domestic action a reminder of his return to the human world of countertops and refrigerators, electric lights, and central heating. He carried the water to the living room window, drawn again to the view of the ocean on the horizon. Even in darkness, he could make out the division between land and sea, a boundary that had once seemed so definite and now felt permeable, conditional. Dawn found him still at the window, watching as the first light revealed the contours of the landscape. He had drifted in and out of a light doze throughout the remainder of the night, never fully sleeping but finding some rest in the liminal state between wakefulness and dreams. Catherine found him there when she emerged for her morning run, immediately concerned by the dark circles under his eyes. "Bad night?" she asked, already knowing the answer. Daniel nodded, seeing no point in denial. "Dreams," he said simply. "Nothing unexpected." She abandoned her running plans without comment, making coffee instead, and sitting with him as the morning brightened around them. They didn't speak much, the silence comfortable between siblings who had weathered other storms together. After breakfast, Catherine brought up the subject of professional help again, more directly this time. Dr. Abernathy, the marine trauma specialist I mentioned, has an opening this afternoon. I took the liberty of calling her office yesterday. She held up a hand to forestall Daniel's protest. "Just an appointment. You can decide whether to keep it or not." Daniel's first instinct was still to decline, to insist he could handle the aftermath of the experience on his own, but the night's broken sleep and persistent dreams suggested otherwise. "Okay," he agreed finally. "I'll talk to her." Dr. Lauren. Abernathy's office was located in a small professional building near the aquarium, its windows offering the same ocean view that seemed to be a constant in Monterey. The psychologist herself was younger than Daniel had expected, with a direct gaze and a calm demeanor that immediately put him at ease. "Catherine's told me a little about what happened," she began after introductions, "but I'd like to hear it from you, in whatever detail you're comfortable sharing." For the third time, Daniel recounted the experience, but with Dr. Abernathy he found himself including details he'd omitted in previous tellings: the primal terror of being in the water with predators, the moment of eye contact through the kelp, the strange mixture of fear and awe that had accompanied the encounter. Dr. Abernathy listened without interruption, her attention complete. When Daniel finished, she nodded thoughtfully. "Thank you for sharing that," she said. "It sounds like an extraordinary experience in the most literal sense of the word, outside the ordinary, beyond what we're equipped to immediately process." "That's exactly it," Daniel agreed, surprised by the precision of her description. "It doesn't fit into any category I have." "The human brain likes categories," Dr. Abernathy observed. "We're pattern recognition machines. When something happens that doesn't match our existing patterns, we have essentially two options: force it into the closest available category or create a new one." She leaned forward slightly. "The dreams you're experiencing, the flashbacks, these are your brain's attempts to process the encounter, to find a place for it in your understanding of the world." The explanation made intuitive sense to Daniel. "So, this is normal? To be fixated on it?" "Completely normal," Dr. Abernathy assured him. "You experienced something that threatened not just your physical safety, but your conceptual framework for understanding the world. That's the definition of trauma, an experience that overwhelms our normal coping mechanisms." For the remainder of the session, they discussed practical strategies for managing the immediate symptoms, techniques to interrupt the cycle of intrusive thoughts, methods for addressing the sleep disturbances, ways to gradually reclaim a sense of control. "Will I ever be able to go back in the water?" Daniel asked as their time drew to a close, voicing the question that had been circling in his mind since the rescue. Dr. Abernathy considered the question carefully. "That's entirely up to you," she said finally. "But if you're asking whether this experience has permanently impaired your ability to enjoy the ocean, I don't believe so. It has changed your relationship with it, certainly. That relationship will never be exactly what it was before. But with time and the right approach, you can develop a new relationship, one that incorporates what you've learned rather than being defined by it." The answer wasn't as definitive as Daniel might have wished, but it contained a seed of hope. He scheduled a follow-up appointment for the following week, leaving the office with a sense that, although the path forward wasn't clear, there was a path. Catherine was waiting in the lobby, trying to appear casual about having remained during his appointment. "How was it?" she asked as they walked to her car. "Helpful," Daniel admitted. "She seems to understand what I'm experiencing without needing it all spelled out." "That's her specialty," Catherine said, unlocking the car. "She's worked with quite a few people who've had close encounters with marine life, mostly shark incidents, but some others as well. The aquarium brings her in sometimes to talk with our staff after difficult events with the animals." As they drove back to Catherine's apartment, Daniel found himself appreciating his sister's foresight in arranging the appointment. It was characteristic of her practical action in response to emotional needs, care expressed through doing rather than saying. "Thanks, Kat," he said simply, knowing she would understand the scope of his gratitude without elaboration. The days that followed established a new rhythm. Daniel remained at Catherine's apartment, his own place feeling somehow exposed, despite being further from the water. He spoke daily with his employer, gradually extending his emergency leave into a more formal absence. The tech company faced with the potential PR nightmare of appearing unsympathetic to an employee's traumatic experience, was surprisingly accommodating. Dr. Abernathy became a fixed point in this new landscape, their weekly sessions providing structure and forward momentum. Under her guidance, Daniel began to address not just the immediate trauma of the Orca encounter, but the deeper questions it had raised about his relationship with the natural world. "You mentioned in our first session that you felt recognized by the Orca," Dr. Abernathy recalled during their third meeting. "Can you elaborate on that?" Daniel hesitated, searching for precision in his recollection. "It wasn't recognition in the sense of knowing me specifically," he clarified. "More, an acknowledgement of me as another being. There was an intelligence in that eye that felt almost like communication, even though no information was exchanged." Dr. Abernathy nodded. "That's actually consistent with what we know about Orca cognition. They're highly intelligent animals with complex social structures and communication. Some researchers believe they may even have a concept of self similar to our own. That's what made it so different from other wildlife encounters I've had," Daniel realized. It wasn't just being in danger. It was being in danger with something that seemed to be making choices about me. This insight became a turning point in Daniel's recovery process. The encounter had not been a random act of nature, like being caught in a riptide or struck by lightning. It had been an interaction, however brief and one-sided, with another intelligent species operating according to its own imperatives. As September gave way to October, Daniel's physical recovery progressed steadily. The muscle soreness faded, and the persistent chill that had plagued him in the days immediately following the encounter eventually dissipated. The nightmares became less frequent, though they didn't disappear entirely. More challenging was the psychological recovery. Daniel found himself unable to look at the ocean without experiencing a surge of anxiety. Even driving along the coastal highway required deliberate breathing exercises to manage his stress response. The sound of water lapping against the shore, once soothing, now triggered an immediate fight-or-flight reaction. Exposure therapy might be appropriate at some point, Dr. Abernathy suggested during a session in mid-October. Gradual, controlled, reintroduction to triggers, starting with the least threatening and working up to more challenging ones. Daniel wasn't sure he was ready for that step, but he agreed to consider it. The distance between himself and the ocean, both physical and psychological, felt necessary for now, a buffer zone within which healing could occur. That buffer was unexpectedly breached on a Tuesday afternoon in late October when Catherine called, her voice tight with professional excitement. "They're back," she said without preamble. "The Orca pod. They've been spotted in the bay again, closer to the harbor this time." Daniel's heart rate accelerated at the news, his palms instantly damp with stress sweat. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked, struggling to keep his voice level. Catherine hesitated, clearly realizing too late the impact of her news. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "Professional reflex. We're monitoring them from the aquarium's research vessel. I should have thought before calling." "It's fine," Daniel managed, though they both knew it wasn't. "Just keep your distance, okay?" After hanging up, Daniel sat with the knowledge, allowing the anxiety to wash over him rather than fighting it, as Dr. Abernathy had taught him. The Orca's return wasn't surprising. They followed food sources, and Monterey Bay was rich in potential prey. What surprised him was his own reaction, which contained elements he hadn't expected. Beneath the fear, almost hidden by it but definitely present, was curiosity. The animals that had so dramatically altered his life were again within reach, their mysterious existence continuing according to patterns he now had personal reason to understand. Before he could reconsider, Daniel found himself calling Dr. Abernathy's office and leaving a message requesting an earlier appointment than their scheduled session later in the week. Her receptionist called back within the hour, offering a slot the following morning, which Daniel immediately accepted. When they met, Dr. Abernathy listened carefully as Daniel described his reaction to the news of the Orca's return. "What interests me," she said when he finished, "is that your immediate response wasn't to avoid information about the Orcas, but to seek more of it through calling me. That suggests a desire to engage with the experience rather than suppress it." Daniel hadn't considered this interpretation. "I just wanted help managing the anxiety," he explained. "Certainly," Dr. Abernathy agreed, "but there are many ways to manage anxiety. Distraction, for instance, or medication. You chose to talk about it, to process it actively." She leaned forward, her expression thoughtful. "What would you think about viewing the Orcas from a safe distance? Not in the water, of course, but perhaps from the aquarium's observation deck or one of the tour boats that operate in the bay." The suggestion sent a jolt of both fear and interest through Daniel. "You mean deliberately go see them?" "As a controlled exposure, yes," Dr. Abernathy confirmed. "You'd be in a protected environment, with support available, observing the animals from a position of safety." Daniel's first instinct was to refuse, to reinforce the protective barrier he'd established between himself and the ocean. But the seed of curiosity that had surfaced earlier refused to be ignored. "I'll think about it," he said finally. That evening, he called Catherine to discuss the possibility. Her initial response was concern mixed with surprise. "Are you sure? That's a good idea. It's only been a month." "Dr. Abernathy thinks it might help," Daniel explained. "Controlled exposure in a safe environment." Catherine was silent for a moment, considering. "The aquarium's research vessel is going out tomorrow morning," she said finally. "It's bigger than the tour boats, more stable, and I'd be with you." She paused, then added, "Only if you're absolutely certain, though." Daniel wasn't certain at all, but something in him had already made the decision. What time? The research vessel Northern Star departed from a private dock adjacent to the aquarium at 7:30 the following morning. Daniel arrived early, his stomach tight with anxiety, second-guessing his decision with each step toward the water. Catherine met him at the dock, her professional demeanor in place despite her evident concern for her brother. "We'll stay on the upper deck well away from the water," she assured him as they boarded, "and we can return to shore at any point if you need to." The vessel was indeed larger than the commercial whale-watching boats, designed for scientific observation rather than tourism. Its upper deck provided an elevated view of the surrounding water, a perspective that somewhat mitigated Daniel's anxiety about proximity to the ocean. As they pulled away from the dock, Daniel gripped the railing, his knuckles white with tension. The gentle roll of the boat beneath his feet triggered memories of his paddleboard, of the sudden shock of immersion when it had been struck. He closed his eyes, employing the breathing techniques Dr. Abernathy had taught him to manage the rising panic. "You okay?" Catherine asked quietly, standing beside him without touching, respecting his space while remaining present. Daniel nodded, not entirely truthfully. "Getting there." The Northern Star moved at a deliberate pace into the bay, following coordinates provided by spotters on shore who had been tracking the Orca pod's movements. The morning was clear, the water relatively calm, conditions similar to the day of Daniel's encounter. They had been underway for about 30 minutes when the first announcement came over the ship's communication system. "Pod sighted at 2 o'clock, approximately half a mile out." Daniel's heart rate accelerated, but he kept his breathing steady, conscious of Catherine's watchful presence beside him. Together they moved to the starboard side of the upper deck, joining a small group of researchers and aquarium staff who were already training binoculars and cameras on the distant water. At first, Daniel could see nothing unusual, just the familiar pattern of sunlight on water. Then a collective murmur ran through the observers as a dorsal fin broke the surface in the distance. Even from this range, its size and shape were unmistakable, an adult male orca, its fins standing straight and tall like a black sail. Daniel's breath caught as the fin disappeared, then reappeared closer to the vessel, accompanied now by several smaller fins, females or juveniles of the pod. Their movement was coordinated, purposeful, a unit acting with collective intelligence. A researcher near Daniel and Catherine was narrating observations into a recorder. Pod composition appears consistent with previous sightings. 1 adult, male, 3 adult females, 2 juveniles or subadults. Movement pattern suggests feeding behavior. The clinical description helped anchor Daniel in the present moment, reminding him that this was a scientific observation, not a threat. He found himself watching with increasing fascination as the orcas surfaced and dove in, their mysterious choreography occasionally displaying flukes or pectoral fins. Catherine handed him a pair of binoculars. "Do you want a closer look?" Daniel hesitated before accepting them. Through the lenses, the orcas came into sharper focus, their distinctive black and white coloration vivid against the blue water, their movements revealing a grace that belied their enormous size. One of the animals spy-hopped, rising vertically to expose its head and upper body above the surface, seemingly examining the research vessel and its human occupants. The parallels to his own encounter were obvious, but from this distance, with the solid deck beneath his feet and the protective structure of the boat around him, Daniel could appreciate the behavior without immediate fear. The orcas were simply doing what orcas did, hunting, communicating, existing, according to patterns established long before humans began observing them. "They're hunting," Catherine confirmed, watching through her own binoculars. "See how they're moving in formation. They're probably tracking a school of fish or maybe harbor seals." As they continued to observe, one of the juvenile orcas breached, its entire body clearing the water in a spectacular display of power before crashing back. with a splash visible even from their distance. Shortly after, two of the adults also breached, one after another, as if demonstrating the technique for the younger animal. "Wow," Daniel breathed, momentarily forgetting his anxiety in the face of such raw, natural beauty. Catherine glanced at him, a cautious smile forming. "Amazing, aren't they? When they're not, colliding with paddleboards." The attempted humor was a test, assessing Daniel's readiness to integrate his traumatic experience with a broader understanding of the animals. To his surprise, he found himself able to acknowledge both perspectives simultaneously. The orcas as magnificent wild creatures and as the source of his most terrifying experience. "They're just doing what they evolved to do," he said after a moment. "I was in the wrong place at the wrong time." The observation wasn't new, but his ability to express it without being overwhelmed by anxiety represented significant progress. Catherine seemed to recognize this, her professional interest and personal concern for her brother momentarily indistinguishable. They remained on the upper deck for another hour, watching as the orcas continued their activities, eventually moving further out into the bay. When the pod finally disappeared from view, heading toward deeper water, Daniel realized that the knot of tension in his stomach had gradually loosened throughout the observation period. "Ready to head back?" Catherine asked as the research team began packing up their equipment. Daniel nodded, surprised to find himself slightly disappointed that the encounter was over. "Yeah, I think I got what I needed." The return journey passed more easily than the outward one, Daniel's anxiety having been partially replaced by a complex mix of emotions that would require further processing. As they approached the dock, he found himself already composing what he would tell Dr. Abernathy about the experience. The next few weeks brought rapid progress in Daniel's recovery. His sessions with Dr. Abernathy focused on integrating the observation experience with his original trauma, creating a more nuanced narrative that acknowledged both the danger he had faced and the larger context of the orca's natural behavior. "What you're describing," Dr. Abernathy noted during one session, "is the difference between fear and respect. Fear paralyzes, but respect allows for engagement from an appropriate distance." The distinction resonated with Daniel, who found himself increasingly able to contemplate a return to water activities, albeit with significant modifications to his previous practices. He no longer dreamed of the orca's eye regarding him through the kelp every night. Though the image still appeared occasionally, its emotional impact diminished but not erased. By mid-November, Daniel had returned to work part-time, his colleagues welcoming him back with a mixture of curiosity and concern. He shared a sanitized version of his experience when asked, finding that each retelling made the story more his own, less something that had happened to him, and more something he had lived through and integrated. The true test came on a clear Saturday in early December, when Daniel found himself drawn to the same beach where he had launched his paddleboard on that fateful September morning. He hadn't planned the visit specifically. His morning walk had simply carried him there, as if completing a circuit that had been interrupted. The beach was quiet, the tourist season long past, only a few dedicated locals walking the shoreline or exercising dogs. Daniel stood at the water's edge, allowing small waves to wash over. His shoes, reconnecting with the sensory experience of the ocean without the overwhelming fear that had accompanied it in recent months. "Didn't expect to see you here," a voice commented from behind him. Daniel turned to find Marco securing his small boat to the trailer hitched to his truck. The old fisherman approached, his weathered face revealing nothing of his thoughts. "How you been, kid?" "Better," Daniel answered honestly. "Getting there anyway." Marco nodded, seeming to understand the journey implied in those simple words. "They're amazing animals," he said after a moment, his gaze on the horizon. "Terrible and beautiful at the same time. Can't help respecting them, even knowing what they're capable of." The echo of Dr. Abernathy's distinction between fear and respect wasn't lost on Daniel. "Yeah," he agreed. "That's exactly it." They stood in companionable silence for a few minutes, two humans contemplating the vast wilderness that began where the land ended. Then Marco clapped Daniel lightly on the shoulder and turned back to his boat. "Good to see you back at the water," he said simply. After Marco left, Daniel remained at the shoreline, watching the rhythmic arrival and retreat of small waves. The ocean before him was the same one that had nearly claimed his life, its surface concealing both wonders and dangers in equal measure. The orcas were out there somewhere, perhaps hunting in these very waters, their existence continuing regardless of human observation or understanding. Daniel knew with certainty that he would never again approach the ocean with the casual confidence he had once possessed. The experience had permanently altered his relationship with this environment, leaving a residue of respect tinged with wariness that would likely never fully dissipate. Yet standing here, feeling the salt spray on his face and listening to the timeless voice of waves against shore, he recognized that the ocean still called to him, still offered something he needed. The form of his return would be different. Perhaps kayaking in protected coves rather than paddleboarding in open water, always with companions rather than solo journeys, respected boundaries rather than presumed access, but there would be a return. This much he knew, watching as a distant pod of dolphins surfaced briefly before disappearing beneath the waves, their momentary presence a reminder of the life teeming beneath the deceptively empty surface. The ocean, with all its dangers and wonders, remained an essential landscape of his existence. Daniel turned from the water's edge and began walking back along the beach, each step carrying him further from that September morning, but also, paradoxically, closer to a new understanding of his place in the natural world. The trauma remained, a shadow that would likely always accompany him into the water, but it no longer defined the entirety of his relationship with the ocean or the creatures that called it home. As the beach curved away from view, Daniel cast a final glance over his shoulder at the vast expanse of Monterey Bay. Somewhere beneath that glittering surface, the orcas continued their ancient patterns, intelligent predators in a world humans could visit but never fully claim. Their brief intersection with his life had altered its course irrevocably, leaving scars that would fade but never disappear entirely. Daniel touched the faint line on his forearm where kelp had cut into his skin during his desperate struggle for survival, a physical reminder of what could not be forgotten. Then he turned away from the ocean and continued his journey home, carrying with him both the terror of that day and the hard-won wisdom it had eventually yielded. In the weeks and months that followed, Daniel would return to the water, cautiously, at first then with growing confidence, tempered by permanent awareness. The nightmares would grow less frequent, eventually becoming rare visitors rather than nightly companions. The memories would lose some of their emotional charge while retaining their essential truths. Life would proceed, forever altered, but undeniably continuing. And somewhere in the depths of Monterey Bay, a black dorsal fin would occasionally slice the surface, marking the passage of a predator, neither malevolent nor benign, simply wild in the most profound sense of the word, a wildness that human beings could observe, respect, and even admire, but never fully tame or comprehend. It was in accepting this fundamental separation, this unbridgeable gap between species, that Daniel finally found a measure of peace with what had happened on that fog-shrouded morning when his path had crossed with one of nature's most perfectly evolved hunters. Michael Sullivan had spent his life on the water. At 60 years old, the deep creases around his eyes spoke of decades squinting against the glare of sunlight on water, and his weathered hands bore the calluses of 1,000 nautical miles. Retirement had finally given him the freedom to pursue his lifelong dream, solo sailing the coastal waters of his beloved Pacific Northwest. He had saved for years to purchase the Selkie Dawn, a 34-foot sloop that was perfect for a single, experienced sailor. The boat wasn't new. In fact, it was nearly as old as he was, but Michael had lovingly restored it over the past 3 years, replacing worn rigging, upgrading the navigation system, and reinforcing the hull. It was late May, and the waters of Puget Sound were beginning to warm with the promise of summer. Michael had planned a 2-week journey from his home port in Port Townsend, Washington, up through the San Juan Islands, then across the Strait of Juan de Fuca and around the western edge of Vancouver Island. The route was challenging, but not beyond his capabilities, and he had made similar trips dozens of times before, though usually with a crew. This would be his longest solo voyage, a test of his self-reliance and a celebration of his new freedom. The morning of his departure dawned clear and cool, with a light breeze from the northwest, perfect sailing conditions. Michael moved methodically through his pre-departure checklist, double-checking his provisions, inspecting the rigging one last time and reviewing his planned route. His daughter Sarah had driven up from Seattle to see him off. At 35, she was his only child and had inherited his love of the water, though her career as a marine biologist kept her mostly in research vessels rather than pleasure craft. "Dad, are you sure you have enough supplies?" Sarah asked, watching as he stowed the last of his gear in the cabin. Michael smiled. "I could survive for a month on what I've packed," he assured her, "and I've got the satellite phone if anything comes up." Sarah nodded, but the concern didn't leave her eyes. "The resident orcas have been particularly active this season," she said. "J-pod was spotted near Orca's Island just yesterday." "I know," Michael replied. "I'll keep my distance. Besides, the residents don't bother with boats. They're too busy chasing salmon." "It's not just the residents," Sarah cautioned. "There have been reports of transients in the area too, and there was that incident last week with the sailboat." "Near Victoria?" Michael waved a hand dismissively. "A young bull got curious and bumped a boat, no damage done." "Still promise me you'll be careful," Sarah insisted. "I always am," Michael assured her, giving her a hug. "I've been sailing these waters since before you were born. I know what I'm doing." Sarah hugged him back tightly. "I know you do. That's not what worries me." Despite her concerns, Sarah helped him cast off at 7:30 a.m. The Selkie Dawn slipped smoothly away from the dock, and Michael felt the familiar surge of joy as the sails caught the wind. He waved to his daughter until she was a tiny figure on the shore, then turned his attention to navigating the busy waters of the harbor. The first few days of the journey passed without incident. Michael settled into the rhythm of solo sailing, relishing the solitude and the simple challenges of managing the boat alone. He spent his nights anchored in protected coves, cooking simple meals on his small galley stove and watching the stars emerge above the dark silhouettes of the surrounding islands. During the days, he sailed at a leisurely pace, occasionally spotting harbor seals or sea lions basking on rocky outcroppings, and once a pod of Pacific white-sided dolphins that played in the bow wave of his boat for nearly an hour by the fee. Fourth day, he had reached the northern edge of the San Juan Islands and was preparing to cross the Strait of Juan de Fuca to Canadian waters. The strait was known for its challenging conditions, strong currents, frequent fog, and heavy shipping traffic. But the weather forecast was favorable, and Michael was confident in his ability to make the crossing safely. He departed from his anchorage near Sucia Island at dawn, with clear skies and a steady wind from the southeast. The Selkie Dawn responded beautifully to the conditions, cutting through the water at a brisk 6 knots. Michael kept a vigilant watch for container ships and ferry traffic, but the morning was quiet, with only a few fishing boats visible in the distance. Around midday, as he approached the middle of the strait, Michael noticed a change in the water. About 50 yards off the port bow, the surface was disturbed in a way that didn't match the prevailing wind and current patterns. He frowned, adjusting his course slightly to give the disturbance a wider berth. As a precaution, he switched on his VHF radio to monitor the shipping channel. The disruption in the water subsided, and Michael began to relax again. He checked his navigation system. He was exactly where he should be, making good time toward the Canadian side of the strait. He decided to make himself a quick lunch while the sailing was easy. As he was heading below deck, a sudden jolt shook the boat. Michael stumbled, catching himself on the companionway hatch. His first thought was that he had struck a submerged log, not uncommon in these waters, where debris from the heavily forested shorelines was often carried out to sea. He quickly scanned the water around the boat, but saw nothing. The Selkie Dawn seemed undamaged, continuing on her course without any change in handling. Michael shrugged it off and continued below to prepare his lunch. He had just finished making a sandwich when he heard a loud thump against the hull, followed by a shuddering vibration that ran through the entire boat. This was no log. Michael scrambled back to the cockpit, his heart suddenly pounding. What he saw froze him in place. Less than 20 feet from the boat, a large dorsal fin cut through the water, tall, straight, and unmistakable. An orca. And not just any orca. This fin had to be at least 6 feet tall, marking it as a mature male. Michael's mind raced. Encounters with orcas were not uncommon in these waters, but they rarely showed interest in sailboats. The resident pods, which primarily ate fish, generally ignored vessels entirely. Transients, which hunted marine mammals, occasionally showed curiosity, but seldom approached closely. But this was different. The massive animal was circling the Selkie Dawn, its movements deliberate and focused. As Michael watched, the orca submerged, disappearing from view. He held his breath, scanning the water for any sign of the black and white form. Seconds later, the boat shuddered violently as something struck the hull from below. Michael was thrown against the wheel, barely managing to stay on his feet. A cold wave of fear washed over him. This was no casual investigation. The orca was deliberately ramming his boat. He grabbed the VHF radio handset. "Mayday, mayday, mayday," he called. "This is sailing vessel Selkie Dawn. Position approximately 48 degrees 24 minutes north, 123 degrees 15 minutes west. I am being attacked by an orca and require immediate assistance." The radio crackled and a response came through. The Canadian Coast Guard station at Victoria. "Sailing vessel Selkie Dawn, this is Canadian Coast Guard. We copy your mayday. Please confirm your situation and position." Michael repeated his location, trying to keep his voice steady as he watched the massive dorsal fin reappear now on the starboard side of the boat. "I am a solo sailor on a 34-foot sloop. There is a large male orca repeatedly striking my vessel. I fear hull damage." "Understood, Selkie Dawn. We are dispatching assistance to your location." "Estimated. Arrival time 45 minutes. Can you maintain your position?" Michael glanced at the orca, which was now swimming in tight circles around the boat. "Affirmative, I am under sail but can start my engine if necessary. I will attempt to maintain position." "Roger, Selkie Dawn. Advise of any changes to your situation. We recommend you don equipment available to ensure safety." Michael understood what they were saying. Put on his life jacket and prepare for the worst. Understood. Standing by on channel 16, he hung up the radio and reached for his life jacket, which was stowed in a locker beneath the cockpit seat. As he bent down, the boat lurched violently again. This time, he couldn't maintain his balance and fell hard against the companionway steps. Pain shot through his left shoulder, but he forced himself to focus. He managed to pull on the life jacket with his right hand, wincing as he maneuvered his injured arm through the opening. Once it was secure, he turned his attention back to the situation. The orca was now directly behind the boat, its massive head partially visible above the waterline. Even from a distance, Michael could see the distinctive white eye patch and the powerful torpedo-shaped body. The animal was at least 25 feet long, a mature bull in his prime. Michael's mind raced through what he knew about orcas. They were highly intelligent and social creatures, known for complex hunting strategies and cultural behaviors passed down through generations. This one appeared to be alone, which was unusual. Orcas typically traveled in pods. A solitary male could sometimes behave unpredictably, especially during the mating season. Sarah's warning about the incident near Victoria came back to him. Maybe this was the same animal, and for whatever reason, it had developed an aggressive attitude toward sailboats. Such behavior wasn't unprecedented. There had been documented cases in other parts of the world where orcas had targeted specific types of vessels, particularly rudders and keels. The orca submerged again and Michael tensed, preparing for another impact. This time, when it came, it was directed at the rudder. The wheel spun violently in Michael's grasp, nearly breaking his fingers. He could feel something change in the boat's handling. The rudder was damaged. He tried turning the wheel, and while there was still some response, it was sluggish and uneven. The orca had partially disabled his steering. Michael glanced at his GPS. He was drifting toward the center of the strait, away from both the American and Canadian shores. Another call on the radio. Selkie Dawn, this is Canadian Coast Guard. What is your current status? Michael grabbed the handset. The Orca has damaged my rudder. I have limited steering capability. The animal continues to circle the vessel. Understood. Our vessel is en route. ETA now 30 minutes. We've also notified the U.S. Coast Guard, and they're dispatching a vessel from Port Angeles. Thank you, Michael replied. I'll try to maintain position, but without full steering, it's challenging. As he spoke, the Orca resurfaced, this time less than 10 feet from the port side of the boat. Its eye, intelligent and seemingly calculating, was fixed on Michael. He felt a chill run down his spine. There was something in that gaze that went beyond mere animal curiosity. It felt like scrutiny, assessment. The massive predator was studying him, planning its next move. For a moment, they stared at each other, man and whale, locked in a silent confrontation. Then the Orca slipped beneath the surface again. Michael waited for the next impact, but none came. Seconds stretched into minutes. He began to hope that perhaps the animal had lost interest and moved on. He used the time to check his boat for damage. The rudder was his primary concern. From the cockpit, he couldn't see below the waterline, but the sluggish response to the wheel told him the damage was significant. He would need to rely on sail trim to maintain some directional control until help arrived. He was also worried about the hull integrity. The Selkie Dawn had a fiberglass hull, which was strong but not designed to withstand repeated ramming by a 6-ton predator. If the Orca had managed to crack the hull below the waterline, he could be taking on water. Michael carefully made his way below deck to check. The cabin appeared normal, with no visible signs of water ingress. The bilge pump wasn't running, which was a good sign. He checked the bilge manually and found it dry. He breathed a sigh of relief. The hull appeared to be intact, at least for now. As he was climbing back to the cockpit, a tremendous impact rocked the boat. This was no mere bump. It was a full-force ram. The Selkie Dawn heeled over sharply, and Michael was thrown against the bulkhead. Pain flared in his already injured shoulder, and he felt something give way, either a dislocation or a break. Gritting his teeth against the pain, he made his way back to the cockpit. What he saw made his blood run cold. The Orca had struck the boat at the waterline, and there was now a visible crack in the fiberglass hull on the port side, just above the water. Another hit like that, especially slightly lower, and the boat would be taking on water. Michael needed to act quickly. He decided to start the engine. Under normal circumstances, he would avoid using the engine near Orcas to prevent injury to the animals from the propeller. But this was a fight for survival, and he needed to maneuver. The engine sputtered to life, and Michael carefully engaged the transmission. The boat began to move forward, responding sluggishly to the damaged rudder, but moving nonetheless. He set a course for the nearest land, San Juan Island, about 5 nautical miles to the south. For a few minutes it seemed to be working. The Orca had backed off, perhaps startled by the engine noise. Michael began to hope that he might make it to shallow water, where the deep-diving predator would be less likely to follow. But his hope was short-lived. The dorsal fin reappeared, cutting through the water on an intercept course. The Orca was now approaching from the starboard side, its speed easily matching the struggling sailboat. Michael tried to change course, but the damaged rudder made quick maneuvers impossible. He watched helplessly as the massive black and white form drew closer. This time the Orca didn't ram the boat directly. Instead, it dove beneath the keel and then surged upward, striking the underside of the vessel. The impact lifted the Selkie Dawn partially out of the water, and Michael heard a sickening crack as something in the hull gave way. When the boat settled back into the water, it immediately began to list to port. The Orca had succeeded in breaching the hull below the waterline. Michael could hear water rushing into the cabin. He grabbed the radio. Again. "Mayday, mayday, Selkie Dawn taking on water. Hull breach below waterline." The response was immediate. "Selkie Dawn, this is Canadian Coast Guard. Our vessel is now 20 minutes from your position. Prepare to abandon ship if necessary. U.S. Coast Guard also en route. ETA similar." 20 minutes. Michael looked at the water already beginning to pool in the lower sections of the cockpit. The Selkie Dawn was settling lower in the water by the minute. He wasn't sure he had 20 minutes. He needed to slow the flooding. Moving quickly, despite his injured shoulder, Michael went below and grabbed the emergency hull patch kit from its storage locker. The kit contained a flexible, waterproof patch and tools for temporary repairs. The water was already ankle-deep in the cabin. Michael located the breach, a jagged 2-foot crack in the port side of the hull, just below the waterline. Working one-handed, he managed to position the patch over the crack and began securing it with the specialized clamps designed for emergency repairs. It was awkward, painful work with his injured shoulder, and the rising water made it increasingly difficult. By the time he had the patch in place, the water was up to his knees. It wasn't a perfect seal. Water was still seeping in around the edges of the patch, but it had slowed the inflow significantly. Michael made his way back to the cockpit, soaked and shivering despite the mild spring day. The Selkie Dawn was sitting noticeably lower in the water, but she was still afloat. If the patch held, and if the bilge pumps could keep up with the residual leakage, he might be able to stay afloat until help arrived. But the Orca wasn't finished. As Michael watched, it circled back toward the wounded vessel, its movements deliberate and purposeful. There was something almost methodical about the way it approached, not the frenzied attack of a predator in a feeding frenzy, but the calculated assault of an intelligent hunter. Michael realized he needed to prepare for the possibility of abandoning ship. He located and inflated the life raft, securing it to the stern where he could quickly release it if necessary. He gathered his emergency survival pack, a waterproof bag containing flares, a handheld VHF radio, a personal locator beacon, and basic first aid supplies. As he worked, he kept one eye on the circling Orca. It had backed off slightly but remained nearby, surfacing occasionally, as if to check on the status of its prey. Michael used the time to make another radio call. Canadian Coast Guard, this is Selkie Dawn. I've applied an emergency patch to the hull breach, taking on water but still afloat. The Orca remains in the vicinity. Understood, Selkie Dawn. Our vessel is closing on your position. ETA now 15 minutes. Are you injured? Michael hesitated. His shoulder was throbbing and he suspected a fracture or dislocation, but it wasn't life-threatening. Affirmative, left shoulder injury, possible fracture, functional but limited mobility. Copy that. We'll have medical personnel ready. Can you see our vessel approaching from the northwest? Michael scanned the horizon. There, in the distance, he could make out a white hull with the distinctive red stripe of the Canadian Coast Guard. It was still small, but visible. Affirmative. I have visual contact. Good. Maintain your position if possible. We're coming at full speed. The knowledge that help was visible on the horizon gave Michael a surge of hope. If he could just keep the Selkie Dawn afloat for 15 more minutes, he would be safe. But the Orca had other plans. As Michael watched in horror, it backed away from the boat, swimming about 50 yards off before turning to face the stricken vessel. Then, with powerful strokes of its massive tail flukes, it began to gather speed, heading directly for the Selkie Dawn's already damaged port side. Michael had nowhere to go. He could only brace himself against the cockpit bulkhead and watch as the 6-ton predator bore down on his wounded boat. The impact, when it came, was catastrophic. The Orca struck precisely at the location of the patched hull breach. The temporary repair gave way immediately, and the force of the collision rolled the Selkie Dawn heavily to starboard. Michael was thrown across the cockpit, his head striking the winch mounted on the starboard coaming. Dazed and in pain, he struggled to regain his footing as the boat righted itself. Water was now pouring into the hull, and the Selkie Dawn was settling rapidly. He knew he had only minutes before she went down completely. Working as quickly as his injured body would allow, Michael released the life raft from its mounting and secured the painter line to a cleat on the stern. He tossed the raft over the side, where it automatically inflated upon contact with the water. Next, he grabbed his survival pack and the handheld VHF radio. The boat was now so low in the water that waves were washing across the cockpit sole. The Orca was still nearby, its dorsal fin slicing through the water as it circled its sinking prey. Michael keyed the radio one last time. Mayday, mayday! Selkie Dawn going down! Abandoning ship. The response was immediate but breaking up due to the failing power of the boat's radio systems. Hold on, almost there, can see you. There was no more time. The Selkie Dawn lurched violently as another compartment flooded, and the bow began to sink beneath the waves. Michael knew he had seconds to get off the boat before he was dragged down with it. He tossed his survival pack into the life raft, then carefully lowered himself over the side, trying to protect his injured shoulder. The cold water of the Strait of Juan de Fuca hit him like a physical blow, driving the breath from his lungs despite his protective clothing. With his good arm, he pulled himself into the life raft, an awkward and painful process that left him gasping with exertion. Once aboard, he collapsed on the floor of the raft, trying to catch his breath and fight through the pain that now seemed to engulf his entire left side. Through the clear plastic window of the raft's canopy, he could see the Selkie Dawn's mast tilting toward the horizontal as the boat continued to sink. His home for the past 3 years, the vessel he had lovingly restored and sailed thousands of miles, was disappearing beneath the waves. A wave of grief washed over him, momentarily eclipsing even his fear. But fear returned in full force when he saw the Orca's dorsal fin change direction. It was now heading straight for the life raft. Michael felt utterly vulnerable in the small, inflatable craft. The raft's floor was only inches above the water, and its rubber sides would offer no protection against the Orca's powerful jaws or battering ram of a body. If the predator decided to attack the raft, as it had the Selkie Dawn, Michael would be in the water, at the mercy of a creature that seemed intent on destruction. He reached for the handheld radio. "Canadian Coast Guard, this is Michael Sullivan from the Selkie Dawn. I've abandoned ship and am in my life raft. The Orca is approaching my position." The response came quickly. "Mr. Sullivan, we have visual on your life raft. Approaching at full speed. ETA 2 minutes, hang on." 2 minutes. Michael looked at the approaching dorsal fin. The Orca would reach him in less than 30 seconds. With no other options, Michael reached into his survival pack and pulled out an emergency flare. If the Orca attacked the raft, his only chance would be to try to deter it with the flare's bright light and harsh chemical smell. The dorsal fin drew closer, then submerged. Michael held his breath, every muscle tense as he waited for the impact. Seconds ticked by, but nothing happened. Had the Orca lost interest? Or was it circling beneath the raft, preparing for an attack from below? Suddenly, the water beside the raft erupted as the massive black and white form surfaced less than 10 feet away. Michael found himself staring directly into the eye of the predator, an intelligent, assessing gaze that seemed to look straight through him. For a long moment, neither moved. Michael's hand tightened on the flare, but he didn't strike it. Something told him that any sudden movement might trigger an attack. Instead, he remained perfectly still, meeting the Orca's gaze with his own. The standoff lasted perhaps 15 seconds, though to Michael it felt like an eternity. Then, without warning, the Orca slipped beneath the surface again. Michael tensed, expecting the raft to be hit from below, but no impact came. Instead, the dorsal fin reappeared about 30 yards away, heading out toward the center of the strait. The Orca was leaving. Before Michael could process this unexpected development, he heard the rumble of powerful engines approaching. He turned to see the Canadian Coast Guard vessel less than 100 yards away, closing rapidly on his position. Relief flooded through him, so powerful that it momentarily washed away the pain of his injuries. He was going to survive. The rescue boat skillfully came alongside the life raft, and crew members reached down to help Michael aboard. As they lifted him onto the deck, the pain in his shoulder flared with such intensity that his vision blurred and he nearly passed out. "Easy there," a voice said. "We've got you. Medical team is standing by." Michael was carefully placed on a stretcher. A Coast Guard medic immediately began assessing his injuries, cutting away the sleeve of his sailing jacket to examine his shoulder. "Dislocated," the medic announced. "Some lacerations on the scalp, possible concussion. Let's get him stabilized." Through a haze of pain, Michael tried to focus on the face of the officer standing beside him. "My boat," he managed to say. The officer nodded grimly. "I'm sorry, sir, she's gone down. We were able to mark the position for later salvage operations, but with the damage you described, I'm not sure how much can be recovered." Michael closed his eyes, fighting back a wave of grief. The Selkie Dawn had been more than just a boat to him. It had been his home, his freedom, his connection to the life he had always loved. "The Orca?" he asked, opening his eyes again. "No sign of it now," the officer replied, "though we'll be issuing a warning to other vessels in the area. This is highly unusual behavior. We've had reports of orcas approaching boats, even bumping them occasionally, but nothing like this. A sustained, apparently deliberate attack." As the medics worked to stabilize his injured shoulder, Michael found himself wondering about the orca's motivation. What had triggered such aggressive behavior? Had it perceived the boat as a threat or a competitor? Or was there something else, something beyond human understanding driving its actions? He would never know. But as the Coast Guard vessel began its journey toward Victoria, where a medical team was waiting, Michael found himself looking back at the stretch of water where the Selkie Dawn had gone down. Somewhere out there, beneath the surface, the Orca was continuing its mysterious journey through the strait, carrying with it the secret of its strange behavior. The next few hours passed in a blur of medical examinations, pain medication, and official reports. Michael was transported to Victoria General Hospital, where X-rays confirmed a dislocated shoulder and 2 cracked ribs. The doctors also diagnosed a mild concussion from his impact with the winch during the final moments aboard the Selkie Dawn. His shoulder was set, a painful procedure even with local anesthetic, and his ribs were wrapped. The concussion required overnight observation, so Michael found himself admitted to the hospital, lying in a starched white bed that felt impossibly still after days on the moving water. Sarah arrived late that night, having driven frantically from Seattle to Port Angeles and then taken the ferry to Victoria. Her face was pale with worry, and Michael felt a pang of guilt for putting her through such distress. "Dad," she said, taking his hand. "I told you to be careful." Michael managed a weak smile. "I was careful. The Orca wasn't." Sarah didn't return the smile. "This isn't funny. You could have been killed." "I know," Michael said, his smile fading. "Believe me, I know." Sarah stayed with him that night, sleeping uncomfortably in the chair beside his bed. In the morning, when the doctors declared him stable enough for discharge, she helped him with the paperwork and arranged for transportation back to Port Townsend. The ferry crossing was a difficult experience for Michael. As the vessel moved through the same waters where he had nearly lost his life, he found himself scanning the surface constantly, half expecting to see a tall black dorsal fin cutting through the waves. Rationally, he knew the chances of encountering the same orca were minimal, but rationality had little to do with the cold fear that gripped him whenever he looked at the water. Sarah noticed his tension. "It's okay to be scared," she said quietly. "What you went through, it would affect anyone." Michael shook his head. "I've spent my whole life on the water. I can't be afraid of it now." "It's not the water you're afraid of," Sarah pointed out. "It's what's in it, and that's a reasonable fear after what happened." Michael didn't answer. He knew she was right, but admitting it felt like surrendering something fundamental to his identity. He had always been the fearless sailor, the man who felt more at home on the water than on land. If that was gone, what was left? The next few weeks were a study in frustration for Michael. His physical injuries healed slowly but steadily. The shoulder regained its mobility, though the doctors warned he might always have some weather-related pain. The ribs mended, and the headaches from the concussion gradually subsided. But his psychological recovery was proving more challenging. Michael found himself unable to approach the water. He would drive to the marina where he had kept the Selkie Dawn, intending to speak with the harbor master about salvage operations, only to sit in his car in the parking lot, unable to step out and walk down to the docks. He told himself it was grief for his lost boat, and there was truth in that. The Selkie Dawn had been specially fitted out for him, customized to his preferences and needs. It was irreplaceable, both financially and emotionally. The salvage team had recovered only a few items, Some floating debris, a life ring, and ironically the logbook, sealed in its waterproof case. But Michael knew it was more than grief keeping him from the water. It was fear, raw, irrational, and controlling. The thought of being on the water, exposed and vulnerable to whatever might be swimming beneath the surface, filled him with a dread so powerful it was almost physical. Sarah tried to help. She arranged for him to meet with a therapist who specialized in trauma, a gentlewoman named Dr. Eleanor Chen, who listened to his story without judgment and offered practical strategies for managing his anxiety. Michael went to the sessions dutifully, but he felt a disconnection between his intellectual understanding of his fear and his emotional experience of it. It's normal to experience avoidance after a traumatic event, Dr. Chen told him during one session. Your brain is trying to protect you from a similar threat, but avoidance tends to reinforce fear rather than diminish it. So you're saying I need to get back on the water, Michael said. Dr. Chen smiled. Eventually, yes, but we don't need to rush it. Small steps, gradually increasing exposure, always within your control. That's the approach that tends to work best. Following her advice, Michael began with simple exercises. He would drive to a viewpoint overlooking the bay and sit in his car, observing the water from a distance. When that became manageable, he progressed to sitting on a bench at the waterfront, park still on land but closer to the shore. Each step was a battle against his instinct to retreat, to seek safety away from the water that had been his home for so many years. Sometimes he succeeded, sometimes the anxiety overwhelmed him, and he had to back away. But slowly, incrementally, he began to reclaim some of the territory his fear had taken. 6 weeks after the incident, Michael felt ready to attempt the next step, actually going out on the water. Not alone, not in a sailboat, but as a passenger on the Port.20 ferry, a large, stable vessel that made regular crossings of Admiralty Inlet. Sarah insisted on accompanying him. You don't have to do this alone, she said firmly, when he suggested she had better things to do with her weekend. The day of the ferry trip dawned clear and mild, much like the day he had set out on the Selkie Dawn for what should have been a routine voyage. Michael felt the parallel like a physical pressure in his chest as he and Sarah drove to the ferry terminal. In the parking lot, he hesitated. Maybe this is too soon, he said. Sarah took his hand. We can turn around right now if you want to, she said. This is your journey, at your pace. But remember what Dr. Chen said. Avoidance reinforces fear. Michael took a deep breath and nodded. Let's do it. They boarded the ferry without incident, Michael keeping his eyes fixed on the ramp rather than on the water visible beneath it. Once aboard, Sarah found them seats inside the passenger cabin away from the windows. We don't have to go outside if you don't want to, she assured him. Michael shook his head. No, I need to see the water, that's the whole point. When the ferry pulled away from the dock, Michael felt his heart rate accelerate. His palms were sweating, and he could hear the blood rushing in his ears. Classic symptoms of a panic attack, Dr. Chen would have said. He employed the breathing techniques she had taught him. 4 counts in, hold for 7, out for 8. Gradually, his pulse slowed. He and Sarah made their way to the outer deck. The wind was brisk, carrying the familiar scent of salt and seaweed that had once been as natural to Michael as the air he breathed. Now it triggered a complex mix of emotions, nostalgia, grief, and underneath it all, fear. He gripped the railing with his good hand, his knuckles white. Below, the water of Admiralty Inlet churned in the ferry's wake. It was deep here, hundreds of feet down to the bottom, deep enough for anything to be swimming beneath them, unseen until it decided to reveal itself. A flash of black breaking the surface caught his eye, and Michael's breath hitched. But it was only a cormorant, surfacing after a dive for fish. Still, the momentary spike of fear left him shaken. Sarah noticed. You're doing great, she encouraged him. Remember, you're safe here. This is a big vessel, well protected, and Orca attacks on boats are extremely rare events. I know, Michael said. Rationally, I know that. But my body doesn't seem to get the message. They stayed on deck for the entire 30-minute crossing, Michael gradually relaxing as the ferry made its steady progress across the inlet. By the time they docked at Coupeville, he felt wrung out but quietly triumphant. He had faced the water and survived the experience. They spent a few hours on Whidbey Island, walking the beach at Fort Casey State Park and having lunch at a seafood restaurant in Coupeville before catching the return ferry. The trip back was easier, though Michael still felt a flutter of anxiety when they pulled away from the dock. As they drove home that evening, Sarah asked, "What's next?" Michael considered the question. "I'm not sure, a smaller boat maybe. Not solo, not yet, but I need to keep pushing forward." "I'm proud of you," Sarah said. "A lot of people would have given up after what you went through." Michael smiled faintly. "I'm not ready to be landlocked just yet. The water has been my life for too long." In the weeks that followed, Michael continued his gradual reintroduction to the maritime environment. He joined a friend for an afternoon. On his powerboat, a far cry from the silent glide of a sailboat, but a step toward reclaiming his comfort on the water. He toured the Port Townsend Maritime Center, immersing himself in the history and culture that had shaped his life, and he began to research a replacement for the Selkie Dawn. Not immediately. His insurance settlement was still being processed, and he wasn't ready to commit to another boat just yet. But he found comfort in browsing listings, imagining the possibilities for a new vessel, a new chapter. 3 months after the attack, Michael received a call from Sarah. Her voice was tight, with barely contained excitement. "Dad, you need to come to the research center. There's something you should see." "What is it?" Michael asked. "Just come," Sarah insisted. "This afternoon if you can." Intrigued and slightly concerned, Michael made the drive to the Marine Research Facility in Seattle where Sarah worked. She met him at the entrance, her expression a mix of excitement and caution. "We've been analyzing photos and video from various whale-watching boats and research vessels," she explained as she led him through the facility, tracking the movements of both resident and transient orcas in the Salish Sea. "Okay," Michael said, not sure where this was going. They entered a small conference room where a laptop was set up, connected to a projector. On the screen was a photograph of an orca's dorsal fin breaking the surface of the water. "This was taken 2 weeks ago near the San Juan Islands," Sarah said. "Look at the dorsal fin. The shape, the slight curve at the top, the notch about a third of the way down." Michael studied the image. The fin was distinctive, tall and straight for the most part, but with a subtle curve at the top and a visible notch, likely from an old injury. "Now look at this," Sarah said, clicking to another image. "This is from the Coast Guard vessel that rescued you." One of the crew members took photos of the orca as it left the area. Michael felt a chill run through him as he looked at the second image. The dorsal fin was identical, the same curve, the same notch. It was unmistakably the same animal. "That's him," Michael said quietly. "That's the one that attacked the Selkie Dawn." Sarah nodded. "We've identified him as a transient male, probably about 25 years old. He's been spotted occasionally. Over the years, usually traveling alone or with a small group of other transients. What's interesting is this." She clicked to a third image. This photo showed the orca from a different angle, partially out of the water in what appeared to be a spy hop, a vertical rise where the animal lifts its head above the surface to look around. Clearly visible on the whale's side, just behind the white eye patch, was a long, pale scar. "That's a propeller wound," Sarah explained. "Based on the healing, we estimate it happened about a year ago. It was a serious injury. He's lucky it didn't kill him." Michael stared at the scarred orca, a complex mix of emotions washing over him. "You think that's why he attacked my boat? Because he was injured by one before?" Sarah shrugged. "It's a possibility. Orcas are intelligent, long-lived animals with excellent memory. They're also known to hold grudges. There have been documented cases of orcas remembering specific boats or even specific people who harmed them or their pod members." "So he wasn't being malicious," Michael said slowly. "He was defending himself or getting revenge." "That's one interpretation," Sarah agreed. "We can't know for sure what was going through his mind, but it does suggest that the attack wasn't random or without precedent." Michael sat back, processing this new information. Somehow, knowing that the orca had acted from a place of past injury rather than arbitrary aggression made a difference. It didn't erase the trauma of the attack or the loss of the Selkie Dawn, but it placed the event in a context that made sense. "Have there been any other attacks?" he asked. Sarah shook her head. "No reports since your incident. He's been observed near boats a few times, but hasn't approached closely." Michael nodded, still looking at the scarred whale on the screen. "Does he have a name?" he asked finally. "The researchers have been calling him Solo because of his tendency to travel alone," Sarah said. "But that might change if his behavior patterns shift." "Solo," Michael repeated. "Fitting, I suppose." As he drove home that evening, Michael found his thoughts returning to the Orca, to Solo. The knowledge that the animal had likely acted out of past trauma rather than random aggression shifted something in Michael's perspective. The attack remained a terrifying, life-changing event, but it was no longer incomprehensible, no longer a bolt from the blue that could strike again without warning. That night, Michael dreamed of the water for the first time since the attack, but rather than the nightmare of being trapped in a sinking boat or pursued by a relentless predator, he dreamed of sailing on calm seas, the wind filling the sails of a boat that wasn't quite the Selkie Dawn, but felt like home nonetheless. And, somewhere in the distance, a dorsal fin broke the surface, not threatening, just present, a part of the seascape as natural as the waves and the wind. He woke feeling more at peace than he had in months. The fear wasn't gone. He suspected it never would be entirely, but it had changed form, become something he could live with, something that didn't have to define him. When he met with Dr. Chen later that week, he shared the revelation about Solo's probable motivation for the attack. "It's interesting how that knowledge has affected you," she observed. "The objective danger hasn't changed, but your relationship to it has." "It makes it less random," Michael explained. "Less likely to happen again, at least to me." "And how does that change your plans for the future?" Dr. Chen asked. Michael considered the question. "I think I'm ready to start looking for another boat," he said finally. "Not to live aboard, not yet, but something I can take out for day sails, maybe overnight trips eventually, starting small, working back up to where I was." "That sounds like a healthy approach," Dr. Chen approved. "Gradual exposure, respecting your comfort level, but not allowing fear to dictate your choices." "The water has been my home my entire adult life," Michael said. "I'm not ready to give that up because of one bad day." 6 months after the attack, Michael purchased a 26-foot sloop, smaller than the Selkie Dawn, more manageable for day sailing, but still a proper vessel. He named it Second Wind, both for the sailing term and for what it represented in his life. Sarah joined him for the maiden voyage, a short trip around Port Bay on a clear autumn day. As they left the marina, Michael felt the familiar tension in his chest, the instinctive fear response that still emerged whenever he ventured onto the water. But now he recognized it for what it was, a caution, not a prohibition. He scanned the water habitually, alert for any sign of a dorsal fin, but the bay was clear except for a few seagulls and a distant container ship heading out toward the Pacific. The second wind responded beautifully to the light breeze, and Michael found himself relaxing into the familiar rhythm of adjusting sails and monitoring wind direction. "How does it feel?" Sarah asked as they reached the middle of the bay. Michael considered the question, taking stock of his emotional state. The fear was there, a background hum rather than an overwhelming roar. But alongside it was the joy of being on the water again, the sense of rightness that had defined his relationship with the sea for most of his life. "It feels like coming home," he said finally. "Not all the way, not yet, but getting there." They turned the boat to head back toward the marina. Michael caught sight of something in the water, about 100 yards off the starboard bow, a disturbance in the surface that might have been a fish jumping or a bird diving, or might have been something larger. For a moment, the old fear surged. His hands tightened on the wheel, and he found himself calculating the fastest route back to shore. Then he took a deep breath, employing the techniques Dr. Chen had taught him. 4 counts in, hold for 7, out for 8. The water was still, now showing no signs of anything unusual, Probably just a fish, Michael told himself. And even if it wasn't, even if there was an orca out there, the chances of another attack were minimal. He was safe. The second wind was safe. He adjusted their course slightly, giving the area a wider berth just to be cautious. Sarah noticed. Anne raised an eyebrow but didn't comment. As they approached the marina, the sun was beginning to set, casting a golden glow across the water. Michael found himself thinking about Solo, wondering where the scarred orca was now, what coastlines he was patrolling, what battles he was fighting. There was a strange sense of connection between them, two solitary travelers marked by their encounters with each other, both carrying the scars of that day in the Strait of Juan de Fuca. Michael would never forget the attack, would never fully release the fear it had instilled. But he had found a way to integrate it into his life, to acknowledge it without surrendering to it. The sea had nearly taken his life, but it had also shaped it, defined it, given it purpose and joy. It was too much a part of him to abandon. As he guided the second wind into its slip, executing the docking maneuver with practiced ease despite his still healing shoulder, Michael felt a profound sense of reclamation. He had lost a boat and gained a fear, but he had not lost himself. The water would always call to him, and he would always answer. More cautiously now, more aware of the dangers that lurked beneath the surface, but answer nonetheless. The second wind settled gently against the dock, and Michael secured the lines. He stood for a moment, looking out at the bay now painted in the colors of sunset. Somewhere out there, beyond the protected waters of the harbor, beyond the strait and the islands, the open ocean stretched to the horizon. And somewhere in that vastness, a scarred dorsal fin cut through the water. Solo, continuing his solitary journey through a world that had wounded him, a world he nevertheless navigated with power and purpose, much like Michael himself. Sarah joined him at the rail. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. Michael smiled. "Just about journeys," he said, "and how they never really end the way we expect them to. Are you glad you came back out today?" Michael nodded. "Yes, it's where I belong." As they gathered their gear and prepared to leave the boat, Michael took one last look at the water. The fear was still there, a quiet awareness of what could happen, what had happened. But alongside it now was acceptance, and beneath that something like understanding. The sea and its creatures were not malevolent, not bent on his destruction. They simply were powerful, unpredictable, sometimes dangerous, but also magnificent. In their wildness, Michael had spent his life in relationship with that wildness. One terrible day hadn't changed that fundamental truth. It had only reminded him of what he had always known, but perhaps forgotten, that the beauty of the sea came with an element of risk, and that both had to be respected. He stepped off the second wind onto the solid dock, feeling the subtle shift from the movement of the water to the stability of land. Both were part of his world now, the safety of shore and the challenge of the sea. He would continue to navigate between them, carrying the memory of the Selkie dawn and the scars of his encounter with Solo, but no longer defined by that single moment of terror. The journey forward would have its challenges. There would be days when the fear returned in full force, when the sight of a dorsal fin, real or imagined, sent his heart racing. There would be nights when he woke from dreams of sinking, of cold water filling his lungs, of intelligent eyes, watching him from beneath the surface. But there would also be mornings of perfect sailing, when the wind filled the second wind sails and the bow cut cleanly through the waves. There would be sunsets viewed from anchorages in secluded coves and star-filled nights on the gentle swell of the sea. There would be the simple, profound joy of being where he belonged, doing what he loved. It was enough, more than enough. As he and Sarah walked up the dock toward the parking lot, Michael felt the familiar ache in his shoulder, a reminder of that day that would likely never fully fade. But it was just part of him now, like the calluses on his hands and the crow's feet around his eyes, another mark of a life lived fully, with all its risks and rewards. Behind them, the second wind rocked gently in its slip, sails furled, waiting for the next journey. And somewhere out in the gathering darkness, Solo continued his own journey through the waters of the Pacific Northwest, their paths perhaps to cross again someday, perhaps not. Either way, Michael was ready. Not fearless. Never. That again, but ready nonetheless. The water called and he would answer. That was enough.